overdue dialogue options. I am here with writer for Heat Street Newsday, among other various and sundry pieces, contributing editor for Reason magazine, author of Ceasefire, Why Women and Men Must Join Forces to Achieve True Equality, and I will go so far as to say, my friend, Cathy Young. Cathy, it has been far overdue to have you on Dialogue Options. Welcome to the program.
Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So we have a lot of things to talk about, but I think we should just nail the elephant in the room right away. Let's start by talking about Gamergate, because this was sort of how I was aware of you before that, but we were both writing about it, me from the inside, you from sort of, you have your foot in two worlds in this regard. And I liked your approach because you understand the greater context, you understand the politics, but unlike a lot of people who are tackling this subject, you understood the culture of, subcultures based on interest better.
And that's because, I'm not a gamer, as you know, but I do have a lot of experience in fandom. Like I got into the Xena Warrior Princess fandom in 2000, and then I was in the Robin Hood BBC fandom. I'm sort of right at the moment. I'm really, I still love fandom, by the way. I think fandom is great. At the moment, I'm really like way too busy to do anything fandom related. I'm hoping to kind of get back in. And, I'm kind of not happy about the state of fandom right now, which, actually kind of leads us up to the subject of Gamergate, because I had a lot of issues with fandom in general being politicized. And it's funny because the Xena fandom was actually politicized before fandom as a whole was politicized, because there was the whole issue of, is Xena gay? And they were kind of playing with that issue and teasing the audience. And there was a kind of very hardcore, zealous part of the fandom that really, really wanted Xena to be gay for political reasons. And like they saw this, are they or aren't they gay, as almost like an insult. And they were very, very angry at times. And like they were calling people homophobic for, liking Xena with a male character. So, I got called homophobic over that. I mean, I got called homophobic for writing a fan fiction. And, it was kind of ridiculous. So I had all these concerns that I could really understand with the politicization of fandom. And when I saw what was going on in Gamergate, I really had, in a way, a kind of sense of deja vu from some of the fandom wars that I had been in. And I think a lot of people in the mainstream media really do not understand how kind of fandom-based communities operate. And I think that had a lot to do with, the way that Gamergate got covered. And, so I think I was able to bring that understanding to it without being a gamer. So I think I could definitely relate to that cultural context. And, and I think what I was also able to see is that what a lot of people were calling a harassment campaign was really more of a fandom war kind of thing, where there was stuff going on both sides. And, I have a lot of experience in how this operates. And, and I was able to see that. And I think, that was something really interesting for me to write about. And I'm really happy with my coverage of Gamergate. There were things that came out of that were not so great. I wrote the other day, as you know, about the strange turns in the career of one Milo Yiannopoulos, who was also involved in the Gamergate scene. I think, one thing that is kind of interesting to me looking back, I wrote in, I think the very first piece that I wrote about Gamergate, I actually said, I think there is this revolt against, the kind of authoritarian strand of PC culture that I think is long overdue. I think there is a kind of groupthink. There is a kind of monoculture where, everyone who is interested in this geek stuff is supposed to think a certain way about gender issues, about, racial issues, about diversity and multiculturalism and all of that. And I think that can get really stifling, where you're kind of constantly told that, you're not a real member of the community if you don't think a certain way. So, I could relate to that. At the same time, I said, I think that any kind of backlash against even, intolerant and overzealous forms of feminism, for instance, is going to be a magnet for people who really do have issues with women, for instance. And more generally, any sort of backlash against, PC culture with its, hypersensitivity to race and intersectional politics and all of that, any sort of backlash against that is going to draw people who really do have issues with minorities. So I think, that is the danger. And I think there's a danger of, saying that, oh, well, we hate PC, so therefore, the people who are PC say that you shouldn't call people certain bad names related to, race, religion, etc. So yeah, we're gonna just take those words and run with them and just start, and we're going to say all these things that are on PC, and, we're going to, and then before you know it, you have people sending, anti-Semitic cartoons to Jews on Twitter, and right, I think
and then saying it's okay, it was a joke.
And then we have Milo, saying, oh, well, they're not really anti-Semitic, they're just being dissident and trolly, and they're just, this is just their way of sticking it to the uptight, nannies of the internet. No, that's bullshit. Can we use language here? Can we say?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Cathy, we've already said feminist. We've already said the biggest F word in popular culture nowadays.
Yeah.
See, you're bringing up, and this is what I love about your approach. You understand the underlying structures that have gotten us to this point. I mean, I've been making so many notes while you've been talking about, you've touched on the inversion of cause and effect, or symptom versus cause. Right. You've touched on, the masticizing of the personal as political, which is, a very valid, I think, second wave concept that has gone crazy. Like, it's almost, I don't want to say outlived its usefulness, but it's suffered from scope creep, right? And then, you've touched on the battleground of the culture war versus the origins of the culture war. And then, the difference between society, individualism, and culture itself. And I think that's what has made Gamergate such an object of public fascination. It's funny
to me because Gamergate is being kind of bandied about in all sorts of ways that that are kind of ridiculous. Like, we're now seeing all these articles that are basically saying, oh, well, Gamergate is actually to blame for Trump. And the funniest thing is, like, I remember when some of the people in the same quarters that are now telling us that, they were saying, oh, well, Gamergate is completely insignificant. It's just, it's just a couple of dozen fat losers sitting at their basement, sending hateful messages to women. Well, now all of a sudden, they swung the presidential election, how bizarre is that?
Isn't this the problem with the Democratic Party as a whole, though? Like, they look for someone to blame instead of trying to figure out how to win.
Yeah. And again, this other thing that I've seen going about, people saying, oh, well, we started tolerating all this hateful behavior on the internet, and that's why things went so haywire. Yeah, like, there was no hateful behavior on the internet prior to Gamergate. Like, there was... It's like, it's like the fall of man, there was a paradise where, the lion lay down with the lamb, and everyone was just wandering about in perfect love and peace. And then Gamergate came about, and, everything became horrible. that's bullshit again, you know.
Because the French
I mean,
Revolution
I
didn't
mean, I've
happen.
been on the internet. I mean, I've been on the internet for years, and this ideal never existed. And, I do think that to a certain extent, there is a certain mindset on the left, where they see the kind of viciousness that they have, perpetrated toward dissenters of all kinds as just normal. I mean, that's just, fighting for social justice. And then when people on the other side start being vicious, then it's like, oh my God, this is horrible. People are being abused. And I mean, there have been I mean, it's really funny to me because there have been feminists, who have written about how incredibly abusive and toxic feminist communities can be, toward feminists who happen to not be in lockstep on whatever issue. And now all of a sudden, it's like everything that's evil comes from these horrible right wingers. Again, this is just such amnesia. And I mean, there has been a lot of really, really nasty behavior on the internet, from people in the so-called social justice community. And, people have been, even recently, I mean, you probably remember the case of the girl in the Steven Universe fandom who was driven to a suicide attempt because she got attacked for, repeatedly and very viciously for, supposedly being politically incorrect in her fan art. And like supposedly making an overweight character somewhat slimmer than she actually was on the show, which got her accused of fat shaming. And there was the incident with Justine Sacco, whose life was ruined over
A
a
bad joke.
joke that she made that, ironically enough, was ridiculing racism and that got misread as being racist. And by the way, this is going to be really funny. Did you know that Donald Trump was one of the people back then calling for a head? I mean, like Mr. Politically Incorrect. Like he was one of the people tweeting, "Oh, this is horrible what Justine Sacco said. She should lose her job." And
Except Trump is fashionably politically incorrect. He's a salesman, so he really knows how to play to a crowd, and I think that's a part of his success. Now, before we get to Trump, I'm sure he would come back, but I want to talk about your book because before we started rolling, I said, do you remember when we could say these things like feminism is about true equality and not get run out of the room, and we sort of had a laugh about it, but I think that some of us more mature third wavers remember what the 90s were like, and remember, like you said, we sort of see beyond amnesia. It's like in DC Comics, the Psycho Pirate's the only one that remembers pre-crisis DC universe, right?
Yeah.
But I want to talk to you about this because this is somewhere I find myself in a lot. I consider myself what I call a mosaic feminist, what some people would call an equity feminist, what some people would call an intersexual feminist. The term offends different groups of people, and so I'm just like, I'm a feminist, I'm not going to add. But there's this fight, this vicious fight over what the term feminism means. Whether it is inherently Marxist, whether it is inherently class-based, whether it is inherently anything. And there are people who will argue to the death that feminism is about the supremacy of women, not gender equality. And I don't believe that, and you don't believe that. So I wanted to pick your brain about what's going on here.
Right. Well, I kind of prefer to not get hung up on terms and labels. I mean, actually, what I wrote in this book, and I wrote this book, by the way, this is my book. This is called Ceasefire. And they saddled me at the publishing house with a really long subtitle, which is Why Women and Men Should Join Forces to Achieve True Equality. So, yeah, I mean, this is a title that really would not work for a crossword. So, anyway. Yeah, one thing that I wrote in here is that, I don't really care if you call, like, the kind of philosophy of gender and gender issues that appeals to me, which is that, basically we should treat people as human beings regardless of gender. It's an incredibly radical idea. I don't really care if you call it feminism. I don't really care if you call it something else. Some people use the term egalitarianism. If you want to egalitarianism is really not kind of a specifically gender issues term, because it's also used to denote, kind of broader concern with, social and economic equality.
Regional issues,
Yeah,
federalism
right.
versus
And
states'
I
rights.
think
Yeah.
it's also been used for a kind of really radical economic, like redistributionism, which is not my thing. So, some people have proposed the term equalism, whatever, gender equalism, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, in terms of like the word feminism specifically, I can sort of understand the concerns that, if you use the term feminism, it does kind of imply exclusive concern with women's issues. And it does kind of get people, like the term itself, if you look at some of the debates within feminism, it really does create these weird situations where, like, if you argue for something that is seen as benefiting men and like maybe possibly somewhere at the expense of women, like if you're arguing for like, more equal rights in terms of child custody, then you're going to have someone like Catherine McKinnon say, well,
Ah, the dork side.
yeah,
Yeah.
like
The
what
dork
kind of
side. Yeah.
are you when you're arguing against, what benefits women? And I heard, by the way, a really hilarious exchange on Russian radio. I listen occasionally. As people probably know, I'm originally from Russia. Russia is also in the news a lot, so it's like, everything that is going on like right now, it's like it's the Cathy Young Full Employment Act, Yeah, like put Russia in the news a lot and put gender issues in the news a lot. It's like, yeah, I'm very busy at the moment.
There's
So
a
I have a lot of
very
work. So yeah,
there's
but I
a
heard this
yeah.
hilarious exchange on Russian radio where this Russian writer who's actually quite an interesting person, but anyway, he was talking about like his views on various issues, and I think the death penalty came up, and he said something about how, well, I completely oppose the death penalty, especially for women. And then he said, well, I guess you could say I'm a feminist. And then the host says, the female host says, well, actually, no, a feminist is someone who supports equality, like complete equality. And then he says, well, I guess that I'm an anti-feminist. So it's like, but it's really funny because even though it was in Russian, I think the underlying conflict over what the term means is very relevant to the Western setting as well. It's like, you can, like, in 30 seconds, you can turn around the concept of feminist and turn it into anti-feminist, depending on how you use it. Are you
Right.
using it as, someone who is more concerned with the welfare of women, which I guess you could say is implied by the roots, femina, or, are you using it in the kind of classic sense of someone who is concerned with equality? Mm-hmm. Now, I will say historically, I think that, obviously the term came into existence, the way it is, because I do think that in the 19th century, and I think the term actually originated in the early 20th, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
But at the time when, women didn't have voting rights, women didn't, by and large, have property rights, and certainly not in the same way that men had, I can certainly see, saying, yeah, well, equality, gender equality means, more rights for women because, women don't have them, and means, equal status for women because there was this, very established notion that, generally speaking, women are inferior to men,
Yeah.
Now, I mean, it's complicated because there was also the notion of women being morally superior to men, which also in many ways got incorporated later into many strands of feminism. So, I mean, I can see how the term is problematic, to use a kind of social justice word. Um,
But any
I
term will be.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm fine with using it. I'm fine with not using it. I kind of tend to, I definitely don't like using the term anti-feminist for, I mean, some people use the term anti-feminist to denote like someone who is critical of third wave feminism. And that is something that kind of puts me off because to me, like again, the term anti-feminist definitely does have these connotations of, being anti-equality, being anti, the changes in women's roles that, have happened over the past, 30, 50 years. So
It
I think
connotes get back in the kitchen and make me a
yeah, I
sandwich.
mean, like when people hear anti-feminist, I think they do hear, woman get back into the kitchen. So, I think that there is definitely that problem. And, but I mean, I do think that everyone gets really way too hung up on terminology and labels,
I I agree, and it keeps making me think of 1984 and Brave New World and all these, dystopian
Right.
control of language. If we're fighting
Oh my
over
goodness, yes.
terms, we're not making change. And
Oh, absolutely.
that's my issue with calling yourself an anti anything. You know,
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
not fighting over whether we should fund clinics that perform vasectomy.
right, right.
Like that is just a basic fact. It's about women's reproductive health. The battleground now is there. And that I think is a
Yeah.
really
No,
important
I
thing,
think that is true. Yeah.
to not
Yeah, although,
politicize.
I mean, there are some really interesting issues, and I think that, I'm very much in favor of kind of looking at different sides of these issues because I think there are, like some of the people in the men's rights groups, I think do raise very kind of interesting and valid issues of, for instance, do men have reproductive rights? Like if the woman decides that, she wants to have this baby and you have to pay child support for, 18 years, even though, you didn't want it. So, why should men have the choice to opt out of paternity? I mean, I think that there is, and I've written about this. I
Yeah.
think this is uh, I mean, I do think that it's fair to say that most, women's issues have another side that, where there is an often unexplored kind of men's issue there too. In the modern world, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily true, in like 1905.
I disagree though, because I mean, the reason given for not giving women the right to vote is it was too stressful. And I
Right,
think
right.
that says a lot about the men
Oh,
who
yeah,
were just,
yeah, yeah,
like,
yeah.
guys, they really didn't seem to want all these responsibilities, right?
Right, right,
Men were seen as totally accountable under the law. Women
right,
weren't when they committed a crime, in the presence of their husband. You're
right, right.
right, it's a teeter
Oh, yeah, yeah,
totter.
yeah. No, definitely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's I think this is something that you get into trouble because I used to say my specific was gender studies,
Right.
and people complained about that
Oh,
because,
because
well,
it
what
wasn't
does
women's
that
studies?
mean? Well, what does that mean? This is just feminism by another name. And this is
Okay.
the problem with the obsession with terms right now. Anything you call yourself, they can knock it down. I get through this on so many levels, and that's why I think I have an interesting view on this, because am I a ginger or am I a redhead?
Oh,
Because it used to be carrot top, and then there was carrot tops are green, and it's like, well, it means carrot colored top, and then it's redhead. Well, your hair's not really red, it's kind of orange, and then it's ginger. Well, that's a slur in
oh my
certain
goodness.
parts of the world, and
Oh
this
my goodness.
used to be because ginger is what you call a cat. It's what you call
Oh,
an animal. So it's taking a term similar to the term bitch. You're taking a term that applies to an animal and applying it to a human being. It actually is an insult. And
uh-huh.
it's,
Yeah, well,
gingerphobia is actually a thing. I had no idea, but it culminated in this kick a ginger phenomenon where
wow.
someone was actually found not culpable under the law for committing assault because of an episode of South Park. And that was when
Seriously? Oh
it
my
was a
God.
case up here. I believe it was in Calgary, where most of the insane stuff in this country seems to happen. I could be wrong though, but that was a joke, by the way, Calgarians. I apologize. But
You'll get in trouble.
I'll get in trouble.
I'm from
But
I'm from New Jersey. New
there
Jersey
you go.
is
Okay,
the
so
New
see,
Jersey is the butt of like every geographical joke that you can think
I
of.
I live in the Newfoundland here is the
Right.
traditional butt of Canadian geography jokes. But the that is when I start going, whoa, wait a minute. The law is now saying media is more accountable for individual actions than people are. And that's when I
Uh-huh.
start getting really concerned
Hmm.
about this Orwellian use of language. Because to me, as somebody who came at it from interdisciplinary anthropology and English literature, it's a weird combination of the two because you've got culture and what that means. And then you've got language, which you
Hmm.
understand is an evolving tool to convey ideas. And people will argue me on that. But Shakespeare made up words, and
Oh yeah,
people
yeah,
people
that's
knew
true.
what they meant because of context and because of sounds. One of the
Oh,
beautiful things about
yeah.
science fiction and fantasy is that we make up races, we make up names. But I mean, J.K. Rowling is, the pinnacle, I think, of this. She used Latin and Greek to create her
Oh yeah,
magical lexicon, and people had a basic idea of what those things meant,
yeah.
even if they didn't know Latin, because of, the words have trickled into parts of English. But this gets
Mhm.
back to that fan wars and culture wars and all this stuff that I wanted to ask you about, because there's this tradition in science fiction and fantasy of, I call it the Tolkien phenomenon. One elf represents all elves, one dwarf represents all dwarves, and they are sort of this perfect representative of
Uh-huh.
their given race, whereas
Hmm.
hobbits are allowed to be individuals and humans are allowed to be individuals, but that's because there were four
Hmm.
hobbits, one elf, and one dwarf. Do you think that way we've been trained to think about representatives and cultures has
Hmm.
impacted the dialogue this way?
I hadn't really thought of that. Yeah, I mean, I definitely do think that, a lot of the time there is a tendency. I mean, are you talking about like the way that it's applied to members of human groups who
Yeah,
are,
like I
yeah,
think that, oh, you're a feminist, that means you believe this. And if you know anything about feminism, there's so many subsets. I don't
oh,
understand why
sure,
people
yeah,
jump to
yeah,
that conclusion,
yeah,
and it's the same thing. Oh, you're, any club or phrase term, I'll just use Jewish as
uh-huh,
an example because
right,
that's me. I don't get in
right,
trouble the same way.
yep,
But being Jewish to me means I don't eat pork or shellfish. That is true of me. I know a
yeah,
lot of Jews that eat bacon.
oh,
So
yeah, of course,
it becomes, and that's what it comes down to. The only thing you have to be a Jew is a monotheist. That is the only thing that is required.
right.
You have to believe in this construct called God, which is actually two different entities in
Well, unless of
even the
course you're a
Torah.
secular atheist Jew, which is also,
Unless you are a
you
cultural
know,
Jew. And
yeah,
this
yeah.
is it's almost like words have become Venn diagrams, like these cultural identifiers. And this is why I don't understand why people get so upset. I've been questioning a lot what even being white means in this day and age. I mean, your experience as a white person coming from Eastern
Mhm.
Europe
Yeah, yeah.
is radically different than what it means to be a white person in the West. Class was so significant.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Ethnic, you know better than anybody. There's different types of white people in Eastern
Sure.
Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is why, like, one of the things, and as you know, I've written several articles about the sort of the social justice movement, for lack of a better word. And people, I mean, people get really hung up on the whole debate about the term white privilege. And I mean, I will say, up front, I really dislike the term. And when you say that you dislike the term, there's kind of an automatic response of, well, obviously you just have issues with admitting that, white people have these advantages that, for instance, black people do not have. No, I mean, I certainly think that there are ways in which, black people in the United States, probably in Canada, certainly experience biases. I mean, there are stereotypes, there are prejudices, people do get judged on race. I mean, there are ways in which, on average, a black person is treated worse than a similarly situated white person. I mean, certainly, I think there have been many studies showing that there is, for instance, prejudice on the part of police, which is not to say that white people do not become victims of police brutality, of course, but,
so
again,
what you're describing,
but my issue, I think, is, first of all, it's a term that seems to kind of lump together all white people. And, I don't have an issue actually with acknowledging that I am a pretty privileged person. I'm, despite the fact that I came to this country at the age of 16, with my family, really with pretty much nothing. I have a background that values education. I have a background that kind of values, verbal and mental, proficiency, which in today's world and today's economy kind of automatically gives me a pretty big leg up. I mean, I came from a background in which it was kind of assumed that I was going to go to college and, get a degree and, get a job in, a line of work that
profession,
is not, that is professional, that is not, dirty, that is, reasonably safe and everything. So, I mean, I have no problem admitting that, demographically in many ways, I am pretty privileged. I mean, if I have an interaction with a cop, I'm a middle class white female who, looks like somebody with a professional job, and I'm going to get treated differently from, a black person in many situations, but I'm also going to get treated differently than, an 18-year-old white girl who has tattoos and, is dressed like somebody who comes from, the lower, working class. So I think this is my issue. I mean, I think this term white privilege really ignores like the tremendous variety that exists among white people, and I think it really automatically labels any white person as privileged. That's my issue. It's not saying to me, you're privileged. I'm quite willing to agree that in many ways I am, but I do have issues with saying the same thing to, an unemployed person living in a trailer. And
so it sounds like what you're arguing, you don't have an issue with the term per se. Your issue is that it's not used in proper context, that people are not acknowledging there's other forms of privilege as well.
Application. Also, the other thing is that in many ways, I think the term is used, and this is also what bothers me, like when very often the term white privilege is used to kind of denote kind of things that should be part of like the way that a person should be treated. Like, for instance, being treated with dignity by a police officer is not a privilege. It's how we should expect everyone to be treated. And I think this is my issue also, because being, not being followed around by a store clerk who thinks you're about to shoplift is not a privilege. It's how, we should all expect people to be treated.
So
And
you're arguing that the word privilege actually takes away the seriousness of the
yes, exactly.
dehumanization that some people
Yeah,
face.
yeah. And I think what we should talk about is not so much the privilege part as the kind of and I'm not even really sure what word to use, but, the dehumanization in many cases of, people who are treated as, potential criminals everywhere
Well,
they go.
it's hierarchy. It's
Yeah,
hierarchy. It's
yeah,
just the acknowledgement that white people are in some places the top of the food chain. Now, Asia is a
right, right,
completely different story, and this is the question. I mean, if you're a gaijin in
right.
Asia, in
Oh, yeah, of
Japan,
course. Yeah, yeah.
white privilege becomes a very confusing thing. And this is what's so interesting in gaming, because there's a game out
Mhm.
right now called Horizon Zero Dawn.
Okay, right.
And there's a conflict right now between white privilege in a tribal setting. Horizon Zero
Okay.
Dawn is a game where a woman who looks a scary amount like me, who is
Oh,
dressed
yeah.
in kind of tribal animal skins, shoots robot dinosaurs in the face with fire. This is totally my jam, but it's been accused of cultural appropriation. Now, there's another tradition at play here, which is Sony is a Japanese company. And Japanese stories, a lot of them in gaming, use red-headed people as it
Oh,
being either a dragon in human form, a mark of the devil, whatever tradition
oh,
you try to use. It has a completely different meaning, and
yeah,
there's no
yeah.
cross-cultural analysis going on. And the game, I believe, was developed, Guerrilla Games is somewhere in Scandinavia. I think it's a Dutch company. And so you have PlayStation, Japanese route, but then you've got the North American route and what that
Right.
means. And then you've got a developer in Scandinavia that doesn't have the same
Yeah, yeah,
indigenous origin. And so this idea of tribe becoming shorthand for brown skinned Native
yeah.
American
Right, right.
in a global industry like gaming, I think that really, I hate to use the term erase because it sounds so
Yeah,
PC and stodgy,
I know,
but
I
it,
know.
it neglects the stories of the Celts. It neglects the stories of the Gypsies. It neglects the
Of
stories
course.
of other pre industrial tribal quasi nomadic peoples.
Right.
And I,
Yeah.
I'd imagine coming from a different background, coming from a very different country that was behind the Iron Curtain for a really long
Yeah.
time. I'd imagine your idea of an indigenous person was very different when you came here.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, well, I mean the whole issue of, cultural appropriation, the whole issue of cultural diversity. I mean, for one thing that really annoys me about the left wing, for lack of a better word,
Mm-hmm.
the politically correct, discourse on cultural diversity, it doesn't really, you just mentioned, the Celts and all these other groups. It's not really about genuine interest in other cultures. It's really just these, political archetypes, these political, cliches almost of other
Cliches is a good way of
cultures
putting it.
that,
Yeah.
yeah, political cliches of other cultures, rather than, actual, other cultures and, the way that they see themselves and, the way that they see their own history. uh, it's really just operating on these completely ideological terms. It shows very, very little interest in genuine, knowledge of other cultures. And in terms of cultural appropriation, uh, if you apply it to a Japanese company, I mean, it's really ridiculous because Japan has
All of
had,
anime is cultural
yeah,
appropriation.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Japan has a very extensive recent history of, appropriating Western culture. There is, by the way, I recently found this out. There's a Russian cartoon that was part of my childhood. It's called Gena the Crocodile.
Okay.
It's about the adventures of a crocodile and this little stuffed toy that comes alive and becomes his best friend. Anyway, so apparently it was a huge hit with the kids when I was growing up in the Soviet Union, and partly I think it's because it was sort of a completely non-political thing. It didn't have any really kind of communist ideological stuff. It was just kids and toys and an anthropomorphic crocodile who sang songs and played an accordion.
Well, it sounds a lot like Pushkin stories as well.
Yeah. But apparently it is hugely popular in Japan. Like apparently it's like a big hit over there, and like they have these spin-offs that that kind of adapted to a Japanese setting. And you know what? I think that's great. Who cares? I mean, I think if
it's funny.
Creation. I mean, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and of course,
well, cultural appropriation is actually one of the modern age's most successful malapropisms. The term is actually cultural misappropriation, misuse of culture. Not because, I mean, the Japanese post-World War II basically went, we got our asses kicked, so we need to study foreign cultures to kind of understand this. And so they invited in the Germans, they invited in the Americans to try to broaden their horizons. Now that is cultural appropriation. When you get a Japanese anime called Claymore, which is not a weapon, that is found in Japan. It's a blonde chick in medieval European armor with a giant two-handed sword. That is cultural appropriation. But so what? I mean, this is the way spaghetti is cultural appropriation. But when you live in a place like America and Canada as well, where it is an immigrant culture, is this cultural appropriation or is this cultural portability? It seems to me like Western culture is a mishmash of stuff.
Of course. Yeah, and culture, and this is also where we get into, it's so ironic that there's this kind of, hysteria about cultural appropriation on the left, and then we also have the alt-right with, its ideas of, racial purity and, cultural purity and, European culture unsullied by, all these immigrant influences and, we don't really want all these people here. And, this is the thing. The funniest thing that happened to me was I responded, I think it was on Medium, or I was blogging for this site called AllThink at the time. I responded to something that the infamous Vox Day wrote on his blog. He wrote this alt-right manifesto, and it was all about, cultural purity and all of that. And I remember that in my response, I said something about, well, the West has always been a mongrel culture. And people took offense. People thought I was, insulting and putting down the West. And,
see,
I thought that I meant it as a bad thing.
You were using a poetic description, and it flies over people's heads. Like,
right, but I'm pretty sure I'm not the first person to use that word in that sense. I mean, I actually thought it was a bit of a cliche, but
it's a mixed breed terrier as opposed to a poodle. There is nothing. Right. Yeah.
But that's the thing. I mean, the West has always absorbed these influences from the outside. I mean, for instance, Islam is a big issue right now, and Islamization. There was in the 18th century, in 18th century Europe, there was an obsession with Arab culture. There was Orientalism was a huge thing. There were all these influences. I mean, you look at European art, going back centuries, and you see, Chinese influences, you see Arabic influences.
That's because were it not for the Arabic traders, a huge amount of knowledge, historical knowledge, would have been lost during the Dark Ages. They were actually preserving these books that the Christians were burning.
Right. Well, there was a huge amount of interaction, during the Crusades. While there were wars going on, there actually was a huge amount of cultural interaction between, Europe and the Arab world as well. And I mean, so I think that this idea that there was ever this kind of culturally and racially pure West is a complete myth. And, Japan at one time actually was a very kind of culturally purist society.
Still
You know,
is to a
during,
lot of in a lot of
yeah,
ways. Yeah.
yeah, Japan, like in the, probably like most of the Middle Ages up until the 20th century, Japan was extremely isolated.
Hmm.
And very resistant to cultural influences from the outside, other than China, which really did exert a huge influence. But that is Japanese culture. Western culture was never like that. Western culture also had, European culture. I mean, it's funny even to speak of the European culture as if it was this one, homogenous thing.
Well, the
French,
Western breakfast in Japanese hotels is to me the symbol for that. The fact that
oh,
they even have that.
what is
Because
the Western breakfast?
what we consider breakfast, eggs, some kind of meat,
Ah, okay,
cereal.
right, right.
A traditional Japanese breakfast is whatever they pulled off the boat that morning with
Okay,
some
okay.
rice and my stepdad taught English over there for a while, and as a good Englishman, he ate beef for breakfast. He thought that was great, but he
Yeah,
wouldn't touch anything else.
right.
And it is even something as simple as breakfast. What that means.
Yeah,
I mean, we don't think the continental breakfast is sort of the Western European idea of
yeah,
breakfast, which is
yeah,
pastry based, right?
yeah.
Whereas our very protein rich eggs and bacon breakfast, well, that's considered an
Right.
American breakfast in
Oh,
some
yeah,
part of the world.
yeah.
We don't consider it an American breakfast because there's a linguistic argument over what bacon actually is.
Oh,
Like
okay.
Canadian bacon in the US is back bacon here.
Oh,
We
right,
don't
right.
have Canadian bacon. We're like, that's halfway to ham, folks.
Yeah.
Bacon is kind of wrinkled. I don't know what you
Oh,
call
yeah.
that Canadian bacon, but
Yeah, but see,
it's
here's the thing. Like, if you told a 17th century Frenchman that his culture was identical to German culture or Italian culture, they would be hugely insulted. I mean, they certainly didn't see themselves as part of this blob called European culture.
yeah.
But all these different cultures existed. They all influenced each other. There was always, there was a lot of movement between countries. There were countries were not static. Borders changed. Borders changed constantly because of wars. I mean, the same piece of land could be English at one point in history and French at another point in history. So,
Yeah, what is now
cultural,
called occupied territories was at one
right,
point called
cultural purity.
colonies. Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So cultural purity really does not exist, and I mean it's a ridiculous concept, and and it's really the ultimate irony that we have the alt-right, which is really kind of rebranded white supremacists.
You actually believe
Right?
that the alt-right is rebranded white supremacy and that's it.
I think that's the core of
You
it.
think
I mean,
that's the
I
core
think
and
that
then
there are
other stuff
people,
got stuck on
yeah,
as
I mean,
that
I'm
snowball
sure
rolled
that there are
downhill.
people, there are people who call themselves alt-right who are not really in that category. I think they're
Cuz
pretty marginal.
to me, it's just the manliest thing to call yourself right now.
Is it?
That's what
Okay.
I kind of real men are alt-right. You know, it's the
Uh,
modern tough guy image, right? It's not
maybe,
you're
maybe.
not using that effeminate latte liberal thing. I'm an alt-right. I don't care about your feels and this and there's just facts and the mainstream media and the news and
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there are a lot of people on the internet, I mean, who are really just kind of running their mouths,
it
and then
just seems
just
to
being
me
loud.
that these
I
20
mean, I
something
don't think that,
guys
I think
want to
they use the label. I don't think they're really into any kind of serious ideology. But I mean, if you look at the people who really are kind of hardcore members of a movement, called the alt-right, I do think that for the most part, with very, very few exceptions, I do think that they're kind of leaning more or less into the white supremacist camp. And
Now
I mean, I
I'm
know
gonna I'm
that,
gonna
is
rephrase.
it white supremacist or is it white nationalist? Like, we have Richard Spencer saying, "Oh well, I want
I'm
to,"
an identitarian.
but I don't
Yeah.
necessarily believe that other people are worse. I just don't want to mingle with them. Basically,
Okay, now do you
but
think
I'm
that
not fine that.
do you
Yeah.
think that causal this is actually a fear of other races, or this is kind of because I'm trying to figure this out myself, because to me it sounds like a bunch of younger people trying to sound like their grumpy old granddad because they enjoy the freedom that people of that generation seem to take with their language. They don't choose their words, they don't seem especially nervous. It's, the movie Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood. He's like the all these racial slurs and these epithets, but he has no malice behind it.
Right. Right.
Do you think that the alt right, because you've said it doesn't seem terribly ideologically driven, do you think it has more to do with the tone of discourse? And that therein lies
Well,
the
I mean,
appeal.
again, I do think that a part of like some of the people who use the label and who call themselves alt-right, like some of the people who are not really movement people, but just kind of hang out on the internet and
Mhm.
say stupid stuff. Yeah. I think that for some of them, I think it is about, being anti-PC and kind of defying the,
Okay.
the PC nannies. And, again, it kind of brings us back to the whole Milo Yiannopoulos phenomenon. Like Milo comes to camp, and well, not anymore. I don't know that he's really going to any campuses at the moment because, he's, I mean, I have no idea where he's going to go from here. But, for a period of time, Milo would show up on a campus and, he's saying all this outrageous, anti-PC stuff about,
Mhm.
women and transgender people and black people. And you would have this kind of cultish environment where these, I mean, where there was some campus event in which I think he was actually like carried into the auditorium on a chair, like on the shoulders of like a bunch of guys who
Yeah.
were, like, and in a way it was kind of a joke, like they were treating him like the emperor of
There
God, whatever. And I think, are all these people, like all the people who are into the sort of Milo cult, were they all, racist? Certainly not. I mean, I do think that for a lot of them, it is about the kind of the anti-PC backlash. I mean, are there again, are there real racists and real white supremacists who kind of glom onto the the anti-PC backlash? Absolutely. Just like you have the kind of hardcore misogynists glomming onto the backlash against third wave feminism.
but
So
then
I
you
think
get in
it's
then
a
you get into the
phenomenon of
issue.
many different origins, and
Right.
and I think I think you kind of have to look at it carefully, and yeah, I do want to clarify that when I what my comment about the alt-right being rebranded white supremacists, I mean that really applies only to the kind of the core of the movement, like the people who are actually like running the show and like putting like the people who like if you look at the alt-right websites,
Okay.
I mean, that's really pretty much what.
The portals.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
portals.
like,
Okay, I wanna ask you
but I mean,
though.
if you look at like the people, I mean, I'm sure that there are many people who, at some point have identified themselves as alt-right who, who aren't necessarily into any of that and who
Yeah.
really just see it as, I mean, again, it's a kind of tribalism. It's like the anti-PC tribe at the
Yeah.
moment. So
No,
some of that.
I want to ask you about this phenomenon because you seem to have great insights on these things. There are people who say obviously racist and misogynist things, but they don't identify as racist and misogynist. They will even argue that the statement in itself is misogynist. I mean, I think Linda Sarsour has said some terribly misogynist things. I think
Oh
whenever
yeah, yeah,
you start
absolutely.
talking about taking someone's vagina away,
Oh my God,
that
yeah.
is misogynist, right?
Yeah.
It is separating a woman from her body part. It is reducing her to the body. There is
Yeah, and
a
it was absolutely, it was terrible. And especially since she said it about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who actually underwent genital mutilation. I mean, what are you thinking, Linda
Yeah,
Sarsour?
someone did that when she was 5. Thanks, Linda Sarsour.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh my God.
but that
That,
is a misogynist statement.
yeah. Yeah.
But she would never identify as a misogynist. And she would even take offense that she would
Oh,
probably take
sure.
offense that the statement in itself is misogynistic. But if you actually break it down, goddamn, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Well,
it.
I mean, I think that there has always been a kind of phenomenon on the left of basically assuming that, you know, right-wing women, or women who are perceived as right-wing. I don't even really want to use that term as if it was factual, because, you and I have probably been called right-wing at some point,
It
you
doesn't
know?
make any sense. Yeah.
So yeah, yeah. Um, or, racial minorities who are perceived as, not espousing the racial politics that they should.
Like I
You
in her style, her
Yeah,
style.
like
Yeah.
women and minorities who are not, being good women and minorities, who are not like espousing the views that are imputed to them as
They're not being
part of
reasonable
their group
Negroes kind of thing.
identity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They are not really, like, they're sort of exempted from the usual taboos on misogyny and racism. I think that's been going on the left for quite a while. I mean, I am not a great fan of Sarah Palin, but if you look at some of the things that were said about Sarah Palin by
Her,
people on the left,
horrendously
were
sexist.
really, yeah, I mean, they
Bill
were.
Maher called her a stupid "see you next Tuesday."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And well, not only that, but like if you look at I remember that when she first emerged on the scene, like when she was selected as John McCain's running mate, and there were there was a lot of interest in her at the time because nobody really knew who she was, and I think a lot of people on the left, a lot of the left-wing feminists kind of really freaked out because they thought
Yeah.
for a moment it kind of looked like she was going to be popular, because she gave a pretty good speech at the Republican convention. And I don't want to get into the whole subject of Sarah Palin, but I mean, I do think that her luster kind of wore off considerably. She really showed herself to not be very
She
confident in a lot of issues.
she
But
didn't have the substance to
yeah,
back up the appeal of that oakley dokley form
oh,
of
yeah, yeah. But at
conservatism
the
that
beginning,
yeah.
when it kind of looked like she was appealing, and there was some positive coverage that she got from fairly mainstream media like Newsweek, and a lot of people on the left really freaked out. I mean, there was I remember this thread on Jezebel,
Mm.
where it was just this rant about how, oh my God, Sarah Palin just makes me so mad. I really feel like I could punch her in the face, and it was like, well,
See,
that's
I
just,
think it went
and
deeper than that. I saw the cycle of the left-wing media go cuz women in politics, because there aren't as many, each one packs more punch. So
yeah.
her clothing was heavily scrutinized. Her glasses were the subject of dozens and dozens of articles. And
Oh
then
yeah, yeah.
there was this whole gotcha piece about how much her clothes cost.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
You
But
don't.
there was the stuff that was like the Salon ran a piece that just was filled with these misogynist epithets, like referring to her as like the hardcore pornographic centerfold of Republican ideology. And I think they also referred to her as like the conservative blow up doll. It
It's
was
an
insane. It
easy.
was insane. And they were there were all these comments about how I think someone else called her a female impersonator.
Uh,
It was just crazy, and it
and
was this incredibly misogynist language.
because it has nothing to do with her views.
Yeah,
Absolutely nothing. It has, and I mean, I get my tits out for a living. I'm a
right.
prostitute. I'm a slut. I'm a whore. What does this have to do with my ideas? Absolutely nothing. And people are like, so what? Men get called names too. This becomes a problem when you start talking about misogyny, because now we start talking about language and the charge language has and what it does and whether something is hatred of women or hatred of the individual or hatred of women because of this individual woman.
And it is complicated because, you know, like even like when like if you call a woman a cunt, you know, okay, that word in England, for instance, it has entirely different connotations than it does here. No. So I mean, British people really totally do not understand like why it's even a big deal. You know,
it's the equivalent more of there really isn't a cross-cultural equivalent, but it's just a word for a vagina.
Yeah,
the same way tits doesn't have the same punch over there. It's true, but over here we generally accept that it is a bad word. It is the worst thing you can call a woman for whatever reason. And so when a guy like Bill Maher decides to use it, he uses it knowing the punch it packs.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You know? Yeah. And so I think, you're right. But then you get into this argument of, oh no, Bill Maher isn't a misogynist. He just doesn't like Sarah Palin.
Right.
But he decided to use a tactic that attacked her specifically on being the wrong kind of woman.
Yeah. And I mean, I will say, you know, I mean, a label like misogynist really, you know, also packs a huge amount of power, you know, and I don't want to use it casually. I mean, I don't think that, you know, using that word about Sarah Palin like automatically makes Bill Maher a misogynist. I mean, I think
it was a misogynist moment. We don't have to say someone, because we can't know what's in someone's heart.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But it was undeniably a misogynist
but I mean, I think there was a lot of rhetoric specifically attacking Sarah Palin as a woman, absolutely. And now, are there like rhetorical tropes that specifically like attack men in gendered ways? Sure, you know, I mean, I do think that that's something else that we don't.
Do they pack the same punch? Like, I think maybe calling a man a rapist is the closest thing you can come.
I think sexual, like men, like if you look at internet, like verbal abuse on the internet, men really do get attacked as sexual predators quite a bit. I mean, you know, I've seen guys get called, you know, rapists. I've seen guys get called pedophiles. I mean, that's like, you're not going to see a woman called a pedophile, generally speaking.
Oh no, then she's just a what do they call them? Hot for teacher trope.
Right. Cougar.
And I have a real issue with this because there seems to be a normalization of female. We don't even have a word for female pederasty, so I just call it pederasty. We've normalized female pederasty to a degree that is really alarming.